Hi everyone, it's John. In my last video, I promised you in a few days a genuine long-form book review, and I'm here to deliver. Several months ago, I read this book, and I think, I think I happened to finish it in December of last year, and it was probably one of the 2 or 3 favorite books that I read in all of 2019. The book, I'll just go ahead and show you, is sorry about the glare, Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty by John M. Barrie. And as you can see there, if you recognize John M. Barrie's name, he was also the author of a book that has been in 2020 kind of rediscovered. It was originally published in 2005, but rediscovered for obvious reasons in 2020, The Great Influenza, one of probably a handful of epidemic or epidemiological related popular works of science or social history that have been sort of, like I said, rediscovered. This, or Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, is from 2012 and is put out by Viking Press. In the United States, there's this kind of pernicious assumption, at least I think it's a little pernicious, that's perpetrated by usually otherwise fairly well-educated, cynical politicians who know better, and that is that we were somehow founded as a Christian nation upon Christian principles. Because of its inherent nationalist exceptionalism, something else to which Americans quite often fall victim to, this assumption has practically become part of an unquestioned national mythos, a sort of assumption of our national founding, at least for a sizable part of the population. The most entertaining carnival barkers among them that befall Americans are the result of a sort of a deliberate, purposeful decadence and increasing godlessness, this being the source of American problems. In his book, Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty, John Barrie goes really quite far in showing how one man, himself a Puritan divine, interestingly enough, sought to ensure that religion was solely the purview of the individual conscience and not the state. Roger Williams was born in England, and he was educated at Cambridge University during a time when the divine right of kings argument, and when he was born it was more like an assumption and less an argument, was kind of suffering its last death throes. In some of the most interesting parts of this book, John Barrie details the influence of Edward Cook, whose name is pronounced C-O-K-E, like the popular soft drink, who is one of the greatest Elizabethan-era jurists in England, working at the time, details the influence of Cook on Williams. Cook is quite an articulate propounder of English liberties, was a profound nuisance to James I, whose authority Cook would regularly and unceremoniously throw into question. And Cook's presence in Williams' life, combined with Williams's relationship with John Milton, whose later prose work, like the Areopagitica, would directly contradict King James's power to censure, probably had an influence on Williams and how he began to think about an absolutist monarchy. Roger Williams especially thought that the relationship between the Church of England and the government was corrupt. After expressing sympathies with radical English Protestants, he was in such a hurry to leave that he made his transatlantic crossing in winter. Imagine crossing the North Atlantic in the middle of winter. Uh, Not exactly the most fortuitous time to do so. But luck was on his side. He made the journey. He arrived in the New World. He settled in Plymouth Colony. And it is here that not only was William's complex relationships on church and state were not resolved, but they were sort of transmogrified. This time his opponent was not King James I, but John Winthrop, who happened to be the governor of Massachusetts at the time. It was his clash with John Winthrop that serves as the meat of most of the book. Winthrop held the traditional Puritan view of religion. That is, God was the ultimate arbiter of justice. To be out of line with God was to be unjust, and therefore it was the government's job to enforce religious ideas. Williams agreed that God was the ultimate arbiter of justice. There he would have no qualms, but thought that religion was ultimately a matter of personal conscience, which should not be controlled by the state, and moreover could not be controlled by the state. He said people will think what they think, and for human beings to pretend like they could ever control the thoughts of other human beings is just pure folly. But Williams's opinion that men, and I use that word here because it was in fact men who had anything to do with Puritan governance, should stay out of religion shouldn't be considered a first step into secularism per se. Remember, Williams was every bit the Puritan that Winthrop was. The point of divergence here occurred because of Williams's theology. Williams thought only God and his church were pure. Ordinary men were fallen, post-lapsarian, and therefore had no business telling the church what to do. In Barry's words, Williams described the true church as a beautiful and magnificent garden, unsullied and pure, resonant of Eden. The world he described as the wilderness. He then charged that Massachusetts had mixed the two, and he used for the first time a phrase which he would again use in the future, a phrase which, although not attributed to him, has echoed throughout history. He says, "When they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broke down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness." Eventually, Winthrop bans Williams from Massachusetts, not surprisingly, consider the way he is very much against policing personal religious convictions. And he would go on to play a fundamental role in the founding of the state of Rhode Island. If you know one thing about Roger Williams, it's probably that he was the founder of Rhode Island. Despite almost every single document we have by Williams referencing God in one way or another, the founding document of Rhode Island mentions no God whatsoever, sort of like the U.S. Constitution. It even explicitly rejects religious tests as a prerequisite for voting. Whether these ideas have their provenance in a strict Puritanism that values individual conscience above all else, or an outre relationship between the church and the state, which had only begun to be spelled out with Williams's help, it was unquestionably a step in the direction of what we consider to be a full-throated advocacy for a very new way of running a society and thinking about the relationship between the church and the state. I'm fully ready to and willing to admit that this book might oversell Williams's importance in the overall sort of broad arc of American history. It seems to have run up against some issues with scholars who find that John Barry's interpretations take too wide a berth in laying so much praise at the feet of Roger Williams himself and for the progress that he created room for. But these arguments, these sort of picadillos for the average reader, for the common reader like myself, are going to be relatively minor. I think this book has absolutely everything to recommend it. It is. It doesn't really seem like it from the cover, from the way it's packaged, but there is a lot in here about, um, like I said, the jurist Edward Coke, which and the way he bumps up against James the First, which is just really wonderful, meaty intellectual history of jurisprudence, just fascinating stuff. And it's not very often that you get things like that on the history of jurisprudence that are that's really written about in a way that can be appreciated by a wider audience. So whenever you get kind of an intellectual biography with a focus on the history of ideas about such an important figure, I really just have to give full-throated praise, especially when it's done so well. So I gave this book on on Goodreads something I almost never do, which is a 5-star rating. Please, if you were at all a fan of The Great Influenza, go check out John Barry's Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty. Quite a fantastic book about an American figure that we know all too little about. I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.